Chapter 5 is a pretty meaty chapter where we talk about the fourth of the 5 idle books called Service Operation. In this chapter, we have 8 lessons. Lesson 1 is an overview of the book, where we'll discuss the purpose of service operation and also provide some service operation related concepts. Lesson 2 provides additional detail on ITIL's 4 functions, which we also mentioned back in Chapter 1. These 4 generic ITIL functions represent the teams who perform the work described in the ITIL books. Lesson 3 is a turbo lesson, describing the very short process of event management. In Lesson 4, we'll spend some time talking about the incident management process, which gets our users back up and running after a failure ASAP. Lesson 5 introduces the short process of request fulfillment, which simply provides a way for us to deal with service requests, some standard changes, and general questions. Lesson 6 describes the problem management process, which is used to find the root cause and the solution of major and multiple incidents. Lesson 7 rounds out our service operation book with the short process of access management, which is closely linked to the service design process of information security management. And as always, we'll conclude our chapter with a series of sample questions, which we'll review in Chapter 8. Let's get started. Lesson 1 is our service operation overview. On the left side of our slide, we have our trusty service lifecycle ball. To recap our story, we had a group of lawyers who just graduated law school, and they decided while sitting in a diner to start up their own law firm. They strategized and wrote down some of their needs and business requirements on the back of a diner placemat. This list of requirements was in business person speak, not techie speak. The list said, we need computers for our 25 employees, and we'll also need the ability to print, and we'll need email, and we'll need internet access, and it can't cost more than $75,000. This list of requirements is the key output of the service strategy phase. In the next phase, the service design phase, IT took their time coming up with a design, and just a design, to solve the challenge the business gave us at the end of the service strategy phase. IT designed the 5 aspects of service design, whose keywords spell STAMP. It also paid very close attention to the 4 P's of service design: people, processes, products, and partners. Service design was a very, very labor-intensive part of the life cycle, but IT knew that they had to take their time to get it right. The Service Design Manager compiled a giant design document that contained all of this service design stuff called the Service Design Package and passed it off to the Service Transition phase. In the Service Transition phase, IT took that Service Design Package and built, purchased, tested, configured, tracked, controlled, tested some more, and finally installed the new, or just newly changed, IT services and components. We have now, at this point, flipped the switch, and the new service, or the newly changed service, is now up and running. And as of this moment, ta-da, we are now in the service operation phase of the life cycle. This is the phase where IT supports and measures the service now that they're finally in use. After the service operation phase, we actually go back to service strategy. We don't go to CSI because CSI is not the last phase of the life cycle, it's the all-encompassing phase of the life cycle. So it doesn't happen last, it happens always. So now you have an idea of where we've been, where we are right now, and where we're going next in the service life cycle. Before we move on, I just want to mention that the name of the thing, the tangible thing that we handed off from the service strategy phase to the service design phase, is an informal document that has the business's requirements written on it. Now, I jokingly call this the diner placemat, but we can call this document a little more formally the business requirements. We also learned that the name of the thing, the tangible thing that gets handed off between service design and service transition, is the service design package. But as far as the ITIL Foundation exam is concerned, there is no actual ITIL titled thing that gets handed off between service transition and service operation. Now, between you and me, we both know that there are handoff activities that need to happen, like training, documentation, a run book, a FAQ for the service desk to use, things like that. But there's no such thing as a service transition package or anything like that. So as far as the exam is concerned, again, there is no tangible handoff between service transition and service operation, other than the fact that now the service is simply plugged in. To the right, we see a picture of the service operation book in case you want to pick up a copy. Lesson 1 has 3 short objectives. First, we'll understand the purpose of the service operation phase with a brief overview of the book. Next, we'll learn about the value this phase provides to the business. And we'll wrap up with the different types of communication you can expect during the service operation phase. The service operation phase is where we coordinate and carry out the activities and processes required to deliver and manage the services at the agreed levels to the business users and the customers. You'll see that this first bullet here is in italics, and this bullet wraps up the purpose of service operation quite nicely, so try to get familiar with it for the exam. In service operation, we also manage all of the technology that we use to deliver and to support our services. And since this phase is also the phase where our services are up and running finally, this is naturally the phase where we monitor performance, we pull and assess metrics, we gather data, and then once we have all this data, we crunch it and find areas for improvement. This phase also provides effective and efficient mechanisms to deal with service requests, events, incidents, and problems using the processes we'll list on the next slide. The Book of Service Operation contains 5 processes as well as 4 functions. I briefly introduced these functions during our first chapter, so they should be a little familiar to you. Processes describe what gets done, meaning processes are steps and activities that we follow to achieve an objective. Functions, however, are the generic idle teams who execute those processes. The trick, however, is remembering which ones are the processes and which ones are the functions. On the left-hand side of the slide, I have the processes and functions listed out in the order that they'll be introduced in this Video Mentor set. But if you switch them around a little bit, they spell out silly things that might help you remember them. The processes spell out I-pair, or the IP address of your ear, and the functions spell out OATS. Now I know those are kind of dorky, but in the heat of battle on the exam, you'll thank me. And as always, if you can think of better ones, please shoot me an email and I promise to give you credit when I teach my next class. This slide here I'm hoping is fairly obvious. What does the business get out of it when IT has a service operation phase? Well, they get to use the service that we've been talking about, designing, and building up until this point. Service operation is the point in time when the rubber hits the road and where the customer finally sees the value in all of this IT service management, ITIL, and service lifecycle stuff. In the service operation lifecycle phase, communication is critical. We should have guidelines for all of our communications, and we need to do our best to conform and comply to those guidelines. The right-hand side of this slide contains a list of the typical communication types you'll see in this lifecycle phase. Things like routine operational communication, as the service desk communicates with users and other technical teams and vice versa. Communication handoffs between shifts. Performance reporting, which shows if we met our service targets. Communication related to any scheduled changes or changes currently underway. Or project-related communication. And of course, communication relating to emergencies and outages. You should be familiar with this list for the exam. On the left-hand side of the screen, we talk about the types of guidelines that our communications must follow. Some of these are pretty obvious, like all communication has to have an intended purpose or a resultant action, and information shouldn't be communicated unless there's a clear and obvious audience. Also, when you write your standard operating procedures, you need to define your communication requirements. Statements like, all change-related communications must be sent by email, or fill out this report at the handover of every shift, gives teams the guidance they need to communicate effectively. Now that we've laid a little bit of service operation groundwork, let's move on to our next lesson where we'll talk about ITIL's 4 functions in a little more detail.